So as we grow, mature, and deepen, our communication needs to grow and mature and deepen with us too. So that instead of throwing an adult tantrum, we need to learn to have many different ways of expressing our needs and being heard by someone who can listen to our needs and can contribute to them without going back to being that 3-year-old believing that they can only get their needs met through a tantrum.
I don't like to argue, so I say nothing and fume for days.
How do I set boundaries without sounding like a jerk?
I hate the idea that I might accidentally offend somebody, so sometimes I'd just rather say nothing at all.
Welcome to the Language Alchemy Podcast, and thank you for joining me today. This is your host, Alejandra, a transformative communication teacher and coach. I am devoted to helping multicultural individuals and couples on the path of transformation transform their lives and relationships through conscious communication. Thank you so much for being here. I'm grateful to have your company, your attention, and your listening for the next 15 minutes. In this space, every week I share how you can bring more awareness to the most powerful tool you have, your language. And this is also the space where I give you transformative communication tools you can put into practice right away to bring forth more peace, more love, more equity into your life, your relationships, and to everyone you communicate with. Whenever we learn something, such as language alchemy, which, as you heard in podcast number 100, is a transformative communication system, an awareness practice, and a form of evolutionary activism, whenever we learn something, it's important to know the foundational principles that what we're learning is resting on. It's important because the foundational principles of anything we learn will guide our learning in a particular direction, and it will also influence the kind of journey we'll go through. As adult learners, we need to know, number one, if that is the direction we want to go, and number two, if the journey is in alignment with our values and our vision. Let me give you an example. Let's say that you'd like to practice yoga. So you start going to a yoga studio and taking classes with different yoga teachers. After 2 or 3 classes, you start to notice that while you practice similar yoga poses and familiar sequences, you feel differently after a class with one teacher versus another. And it may be because of the teacher's foundational principles. So, for example, for one teacher, their foundational principle may be a healthy and strong physical body. And so the class may be focused on postures, toning, muscle strength. And when that teacher is guiding you in class, then that teacher is going to be used language that's related to your body and also related to strength. They may mention muscle groups, and they may tell you that the poses they're teaching you are to strengthen a particular part of your body. Now, in another yoga class with a different teacher, if that other teacher's foundational principles are more about the alchemical and transformative aspect of yoga, you will hear a different kind of language and a different kind of guidance. So even though you are going to be doing perhaps similar poses or familiar sequences, you are going to hear more about the union of the physical body, the energy, the mind, and spirit. There may be more of a focus on the breath, on noticing what's going on inside, on understanding your energy flow, on taking the practice of yoga out of the mat and applying the principles of yoga in your daily life. So, as you can see, depending on the teacher's foundational principles, that teacher is going to use specific language that's influenced by those principles, and you are going to be guided in a particular way, and also the journey to get there will be based on those principles. In this episode, I want to share about the 8 foundational principles of language alchemy, so that you can understand that all I teach, all you learn with me is guided by and based on these principles. And of course, the language I use to teach you about these principles of language alchemy is also influenced by them. And because language alchemy has 8 foundational principles, I am going to talk about 4 of them in this episode and 4 of them in the next episode. So let's begin. Principle number 1. The language we use is one of the most powerful tools we have to look at reality, understand reality, and relate to reality. And that means that the language we use directly impacts the condition of our life, our relationships, and our world. Let me give you a situation. Let's say that your neighbor listens to loud music late at night several times a week. And when the evening comes and you hear the loud music coming from your neighbor's home, you think of your neighbor as someone who is disrespectful and selfish. When you hear him play loud music at night, internally, you say to yourself something like, how can this person be so selfish? This person only cares about himself. That's so rude and disrespectful. Now, when you run into your neighbor during the day, even though you tend to say hello to people and smile to them because that's what you usually do, when you run into your neighbor, the one who plays music at night, you either say a quick, curt hello, or you try to avoid greeting your neighbor altogether. So see, the language we use is one of the most powerful tools we have to look at reality, understand reality, and relate to reality. When you use the language, quote unquote, you are selfish, disrespectful, rude, to think of your neighbor or to talk about them, you are looking at your neighbor that way, through that lens of selfishness, lack of respect, rudeness. And then you relate to your neighbor the way you look at him. So that language directly impacts the condition of your life because maybe you experience more stress. And since you are not asking your neighbor to turn the music down, then you can't sleep very well, and that impacts your health as well. But it also impacts the kind of relationship you have with your neighbor, which in this case could be an antagonistic one. Principle number 2. The language you speak is a language you learned, and you have the capacity to learn to communicate differently. Let me explain this one. When you were a child, you learned to use the language of your caregivers, your family, the communities you belong to, and the specific social and historical context in which you were raised. Now, let's suppose that when you were young at some point, and I can assure you that this was true, but at some point when you were young, your caregivers were upset or they were irritated with you. Now, if when they had that experience of being upset or irritated with you, they called you names like you're being rude, you're a bad child, you're a difficult kid, then you learn that that is how you communicate to another person when you are upset or feeling irritated with them. So years later, decades later, let's say your partner does or says something and you feel upset or irritated with them, you call your partner names. Maybe you call them rude, bad, difficult. Maybe you use cuss words. And then your relationship starts to get negatively impacted. Your partner feels very hurt. In those moments, it's when you need to remember that you have the capacity to learn to communicate differently. You do not need to keep repeating the language you have learned, because that language you've learned, that's not your language. So you need to learn that there are several different ways of letting your partner know that you are upset or that you are irritated with them without calling them names. Principle number 3. Authentic communication is about learning to use your own language with awareness, intentionality, and responsibility. Let's continue with this example I just gave you of feeling upset and irritated with your partner, which, by the way, is completely natural and human. It doesn't matter how much you love your partner or how much you know your partner's intrinsic goodness. At some point, you are going to get upset and irritated with them. Human nature. Now, authentic communication is about learning to use your own language with awareness, intentionality, and responsibility. So, first, you learn to become aware of the language you use with your partner when you are upset or irritated with them. Then, you become curious about how the language you're using is impacting your partner, yourself, and the relationship. And then next time you get upset or irritated, you learn to be intentional and use a language that can accurately express your intention. In other words, you become responsible for the language you use because you know that the language you use directly impacts the condition of your life and relationship. And now let's talk about language alchemy principle number 4. As we grow, mature, and deepen, our communication needs to grow, mature, and deepen. My work is mainly with adults. And as you may have heard in other podcast episodes, or if you've been following me for a while, you know that I did work as an elementary school teacher for many years. And you also know that I've studied what's called language acquisition. That is to say, how we learn to use language to communicate. Well, it takes us about our first 7 years of life to learn the language we speak. And during these first 7 years, our brain is not fully developed. It's still developing. We're also not psychologically developed. We are developing. So unless we consciously explore the language we're using as we are growing and developing and maturing, we're still going to communicate using language patterns that belong to our language learning phase during our first 7 years of life. Let me give you an example. If during our first years of life we threw a tantrum when we didn't get what we wanted, and we learned that throwing a tantrum was the only way to get what we wanted as a child because it was the only time our caregivers paid more attention to us or listened to our needs, then as adults, unless we work on our communication, we may be in our 30s, 40s, 50s, 60s, 70s, but when we don't get what we want, guess what we're going to do? We are going to communicate like the 3-year-old we were. We may not stomp our feet on the ground, but we may throw an adult tantrum. So maybe we yell, we cry, we're overly emotional, we throw things on the ground, we stomp out of a room, we slam on doors and things like that. So as we grow, mature, and deepen, our communication needs to grow and mature and deepen with us too. So that instead of throwing an adult tantrum, we need to learn to have many different ways of expressing our needs and being heard by someone who can listen to our needs and can contribute to them without going back to being that 3-year-old believing that they can only get their needs met through a tantrum. Now, I mentioned that there are 8 principles of language alchemy I stand by and that guide everything I teach and how I teach. And because we adults get so much information every single day, I'd love for you to absorb and integrate these 4 principles first. So I am going to teach you principles 5 through 8 in the next episode. But before you go, I'd like to offer you some transformative communication tools in the form of compassionate inquiry. I have 4 questions for you, And each question is based on the first 4 language alchemy principles I just shared with you. Number 1, the language you use is one of the most powerful tools you have to look at reality, understand reality, and relate to reality. And the easiest way to notice this is when there is some kind of misunderstanding, some kind of challenge or difficult in an interaction. Then consider the kind of language you tend to use about yourself and the other person. Notice how that language is generating some kind of understanding about who you are and who the other person is. And then reflect on how this understanding impacts how you relate to yourself and the other person. Number 2, the language you speak is a language you learned, and you have the capacity to learn to communicate differently. So consider something you've said to someone that now you regret having said that out loud. And now ask yourself, who did you learn this kind of communication from? And once you know that, take a moment to consider how you would like to communicate differently in a future similar situation. Number 3, authentic communication is about learning to use your own language with awareness, intentionality, and responsibility. Let's continue reflecting on the previous scenario, the one in which you said something you later regretted saying. Now, were you aware of what you were saying at the moment? What was your intention? And with this awareness, now take full responsibility for what you said and your intention. You are not less good or less bad of a person for taking responsibility. No, every time you take responsibility, you are a more conscious and a more mature person. And now notice if in the future you'd like to have a similar or a different intention in a situation like this. And think of how you would like to communicate that is more in alignment with the intention that you're now aware of. Number 4, as you grow, mature, and deepen, your communication needs to grow, mature, and deepen too. All the reflection you have done today has helped your communication grow, deepen, and mature. So allow yourself to notice how honorable it is to grow, to mature, and to deepen your communication. When your communication is in alignment with the conscious, compassionate, and mature adult that you are, you can have the life and relationships your heart longs for and that our human family really needs. And now, let's recap what you've heard in this episode. Today, we talked about the importance of knowing and understanding the principles underlying anything you learn. I shared with you that Language Alchemy has 8 foundational principles, and today I explained the first 4. Number 1, the language you use is one of the most important tools you have to look at reality, understand reality, and relate to reality. Number 2, the language you speak is a language you learned, and you have the capacity to learn to communicate differently. Number 3, authentic communication is about learning to use your own language with awareness, intentionality, and responsibility. Number 4, as you grow, mature, and deepen, your communication needs to grow, mature, and deepen too. Then I offered you some compassionate inquiry or questions for you to reflect on that are based on these 4 principles. Next week, I am going to share with you the remaining 4 language alchemy principles. And as usual, I'd love to hear from you about how this episode or the inquiry has helped you increase your awareness about how you communicate. And if you are noticing that it's time for you to do the honorable work of becoming more aware and more mature with your communication, then reach out to me via email. If you receive my newsletters every Wednesday, you have my email, so you can just reply to that email. Or if you follow me on Instagram, you can go to @Language Alchemy and send me a direct message. At the moment, I have 2 spots available for new communication coaching clients. Thank you so much for listening, and a special thanks to Daza, Corey, Maria, and Christina for reaching out to me and let me know about something you enjoyed about the recent episodes of the Language Alchemy Podcast. Until next week, and as we say in Argentina, ciao ciao. Original music by Gary LaPoe. You can find all links in the show notes at languagealchemy.com.